today, so if you have your cell phone on you, I'd encourage you to turn it off because you're going to get lots of text messages. So welcome everyone. My name is Dan Edelstein. I'm one of the faculty instructors in education as self-fashioning, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Anthony Grafton, who is the Henry Putnam University Professor of History at Princeton. While trying to think of the clearest way of explaining especially to our freshmen, why all of us were so excited to bring Tony to campus to speak to you in this context, I thought of the following comparison, which I hope Tony will forgive me for. Tony is very much like the Pope. He is the spiritual and sometimes even temporal leader of a venerable institution that spans every continent, the Guild of Historians. By all accounts, he is infallible. Wherever he goes, large crowds gather to hear him, and he can usually address them in their own tongue. Even his Latin is excellent, though I've heard that's no longer a prerequisite for being Pope. But the real reason that we wanted Tony to speak to you is that he truly is unique in combining two superlative qualities. The first is that, in most eyes, he is the preeminent humanist in the country. And what's more, his field of specialization is extremely relevant for our course. Tony studies the history of scholarship, the history of learning, including the practices and institutions of learning. He focuses mostly on early modern Europe, which is precisely the time when the Studia Humanitatis, or as we say today, humanities, received their modern shape. Though I should note that he is equally at home when discussing late antiquity or even the Enlightenment. Perhaps it is the sign of a true Renaissance man that he does not stay within the confines of the Renaissance. The second remarkable quality that naturally drew us to Tony is his role as a public intellectual, and more particularly his role as a sharp, watchful, and again, infallible commentator on our contemporary institutions of higher learning. In his books, in the pages of the New Yorker, the New York Review, Times Literary Supplement, many other venues, Tony offers a steady stream of wise, sometimes alarming, but never alarmist, unless there's a good reason to be alarmed, commentary about the state of higher education in this country, but also in the UK and the rest of Europe. Few individuals, few intellectuals rise to such prominence in either of these fields. No one, to my knowledge, has risen to such prominence in both. And I'll end just by mentioning one final quality of Tony's style as a commentator, which is a trait that we hope you emulate as you fashion your minds here at Stanford and beyond. Too often when intellectuals, be they professors or other professionals, enter into the fray of public debate, they tend to stake out the most controversial positions, thereby guaranteeing attention. Majors aren't preparing students for the real world? Abolish departments. Colleges are too expensive? Abolish tenure. Have all students enroll in MOOCs and stay at home. That will solve the student debt problem. Against this unfortunate tendency, Tony never pushes a simplistic solution to a complicated problem. He dares to stand up and say, in the language that you will all be familiar with, it's complicated. That is the sign of a real intellectual, and let me tell you, they do not get any more real than Anthony Grafton. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you all for having me. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I'm actually teaching a Western Civ course for freshmen at Princeton, and it's very fascinating to see how this really complex and interesting set of courses in a single sort of rubric have been organized. I should say, though, two things. One is the Pope speaks beautiful Latin, current Pope. But as for papal infallibility, Pius IX, who really invented papal infallibility, well, Cardinal Gibbons, an English cardinal at the same time, was asked what he thought about infallibility. He said, well, I don't know, but the Pope always calls me Gibbons. When Petrarch became 60 years old, and there's a heroic vision of Petrarch on a beautiful manuscript of the Canzoniere, And in a way, that's the Petrarch I'm talking about today, the Petrarch who appears in author portraits, the Petrarch who was and made himself a celebrity of a new kind. And that's the part of his work and life I'm talking about. When Petrarch reached the age of 60, he tells us in the letter to posterity, his sharp eyesight deserted him and he had to wear glasses. You'll notice that his portraitist does not include the glasses. And though there are dozens of these portraits, he never wears glasses in them. The vanity is not important, but the glasses are fascinating for two reasons. First of all, he's almost the first person we can name to have worn glasses and to have kept his working life going for 10 years, from age 60 till his death at age 70. And this is really a quiet and tremendous revolution in the working power of Western Europe when glasses came in the late 13th and 14th centuries. Suddenly, people, and most people died young. Those who didn't die young lived quite a long time. Suddenly, glasses made them able to carry on exacting crafts or literature far longer than ever. Petrarch, of course, didn't know any of that. What he did know, though, and this was perhaps equally original, was it was interesting that he wore glasses. And hundreds of years later, people would want to know that the great poet had worn glasses. And that, I submit, is one of the ways in which Petrarch really represents something new in the world. To remind you just of some basic facts, Petrarch lived from 1304 to 74. He came from a Florentine family, driven into political exile, as so many were in the 13th and 14th centuries. He was the son of a notary, a man who prepared contracts and other official documents, studied the law himself at university in Montpellier and then at Bologna, the greatest of the medieval law schools, and created, among many other parts of the classic arc of the liberal arts student and poet, he created that of the one who says, I can't stand law, and gave it up. Not to horrify his parents, it was actually his father's death that enabled him to give up the law. He became a minor cleric, and he soon found patrons, sponsors, especially two brothers, Giovanni and Giacomo, of the great Colonna family, a fantastically rich and powerful family whose bravi dominated half of the city of Rome. They were really kind of like the Crips to the other family, who were sort of like the Bloods, but their top people were high churchmen, and they offered him preferment. He became a great scholar. The 14th century was a moment in which a lot of Italians were turning back to antiquity in a new way, really interested in bringing together the different kinds of records of the ancient world. For example, here you see a Veronese scholar, Giovanni Manzanario, an official of the cathedral, a place that Petrarch visited, studying Roman coins. This is his history of Rome, and he's using coins to illuminate the history that he could get from texts. Petrarch spent his life in dialogue with people like these, exchanging information, exchanging manuscripts. All books were transmitted as manuscripts. Printing won't be introduced to the West until the middle of the 15th century, and encouraging them to do what the Renaissance laughingly called discovering lost classical texts. Now, discovering a lost classical text means that you go to a monastery, you find a book that they've preserved over 1,000 years, you steal it, you start copying it and make it, that's discovering classical texts. And this is one of the great enterprises of Western scholarship, and Petrarch is really its inspirer. Many of his friends, especially Giovanni Boccaccio, author of the Decameron, are partners with him in this. Soon he began writing massive works on the model of the ancient books that he was studying so interestedly, a compendium of the lives of great men, compilations of moral essays, and most ambitious of all, poetry, bucolic and finally epic poetry, modeled on that of Virgil. His great enterprise, as you've read in the letter to posterity, takes the form of an epic on Scipio Africanus's defeat of Carthage. He also becomes in public, before he's a famous writer of Latin, he's a famous writer of Italian, a writer of lyric poetry, which becomes extraordinarily popular, though he's always a little ambivalent about the role of the modern language in his fame and in his career. And as he emphasizes, I'll come back to this later on, it's his fame as a Latinist, the fame won by the knowledge that the Africa existed, not by anyone's reading it, that won him the coronation that he had. The coronation's fabulous. So Roman poets had had contests on the Capitoline, which he knew about, and medieval scholars had elaborate ceremonies where they were vested with doctoral gowns after being examined. So he brings the two together. And he has an exam from King Robert of Naples, who spends 3 days talking to him, and then he gets the wrong kind of crown, laurel rather than myrtle, put on his head on the Capitol. It's a beautiful stage-managed thing. The thing you should know about it is that, of course, he says, this all came as a surprise. Everybody wanted me to be crowned. In fact, of course, he'd organized the whole thing and been writing letters about it for years. He survives terrible things, above all the Black Death of 1348, which takes off Laura, the object of his poems, or at least supposedly did so, and many of his close friends, goes on writing, and by 1350-51, he is a celebrity. The Pope wants him to come and be a secretary, the highest office the Pope can offer to an intellectual. Florence wants him to come home and be a professor at the university. He is the most famous layman, because he's given up his clerical career, in Europe at this time. I think it's fair to say that. He never stops writing. Late in life, when some young friends from the University of Padua, who think that the new technical philosophy they're studying is really hot, make fun of him and say, well, Petrarch, he's not very smart, you know, he's just a very sweet guy. He writes a magnificent book on his own ignorance and that of many others. A great polemic, slightly marred by the wrong pronoun in the title, but still a wonderful polemic. He is always, I think it's fair to say, primarily and often most concerned with portraying himself. And though his works cover vast ranges of times, places, and materials, his central topic is always Petrarch, or almost always Petrarch. And that's why I suggested you read the letter to posterity, and it's the way he constructs this extraordinary self that I'll be talking about. What is it you need? What is it that Petrarch had that enables him to write texts like these, for which it's really, I think, impossible to find full prototypes? Sources he had, as we'll see, but there's nothing really like this letter or the other texts in which he presents himself. Well, the first thing you need to know about Petrarch, I think, is that he is a Florentine. And even though he grows up in exile, the Florentines were the most preternaturally self-conscious and articulate inhabitants of urban Italy, which was the most preternaturally articulate and self-conscious society in Europe as a whole. In 14th century Europe, people believed, as we all believe we're middle class. Every American knows he's middle class, whether he is Mitt Romney or me, though I would say my claim is a stronger one. In Italy, people knew they belonged to very different, not classes, but orders of society. Whether you worked with your head or your hands was reflected in what you wore, was reflected in where you lived, was reflected in every aspect of your life. But Florence and other mercantile cities, Florence more than any, was a place where nobody was sure of remaining in a category or a social order throughout all their lives. It was a mercantile society. It lived by banking and manufacturing. When the Black Death of 1348 killed off half or more of the population of Europe, a city that depended on cloth manufacturing had to find new ways of surviving. No Florentine could ever be confident that he would be prosperous until his death. And while Petrarch was middle-aged, the two greatest Florentine banks, the greatest in Europe, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, were bankrupted by royal refusal to pay their debts. Back in the 1970s, when lending money to dubious governments was a big thing at the then fancy banks, I used to warn my students about this, but of course they never paid any attention. So here you see a great Florentine banker and merchant a little later than Petrarch, who takes as his sign the sail blown by wind. And the word for wind is fortuna. So this is what he puts all over his palace. It's just the sail being blown, a life in which you have no control. And one of the consequences of this life seemingly controlled outside is that Florentines become tremendously articulate about themselves, their lives, their values. They write before almost anyone else in Europe So ordinary Florentine merchants, notaries like Petrarch's father, manufacturers begin to write works in Italian in which they address themselves usually to their sons, and in which they talk about what you have to do to survive in this dangerous society, this piranha pit of a city. By the way, Florentine tax practice in the time of Petrarch was very simple. If you wanted to know how much money Dan should pay in tax, you would go to his neighbor Beth and say, "Can you tell me how much money Dan has?" And she would tell you. And then you would go to him and ask how much money he had. You can imagine that this didn't make for good social relations. So it's a dangerous world. It's a world of constant rivalry. And we find in these ricordanze, these memoirs that the Florentines write, a kind of passion for recording the details of life, its joys and its problems, that you don't see elsewhere in this time. Here's a particularly wonderful example from a physician remembering the day when he treated Donatello, who gave him a lovely tondo, which, as it happens, survives. More relevant to Petrarch are the ricordanze that express the complexities of life, that talk about the torments and difficulties of trying to be Christian in a society that lived by gain, of trying to resist the pressures of a commercial society and the pressures of the powerful while keeping some kind of allegiance to a Christian code. Here's my favorite Florentine diarist, a man much of whose life overlaps Petrarch's. Gorodati, a sophisticated, well-traveled man. He wrote geographies. He'd been in Africa and traded cloth there. Here he is reflecting on his midlife crisis. "I know," he says, "that in this wretched life our sins expose us to tribulations of soul and passions of the body. I see that since my birth 40 years ago, I've given little heed to God's commandments, distrusting my own power to reform, but hoping to advance by degrees along the path of virtue. I resolve from this day forward to refrain from going to the shop or conducting business on church holidays, or from permitting others to work for me or seek temporal gains on such days. And whenever I make exceptions in cases of necessity, I promise on the next day to distribute alms of 1 gold florin to God's poor. I've written this down so I may remember my promise and be ashamed if I should chance to break it." So Petrarch, the man who writes about his own faults, his own efforts to amend his life in such passionate detail, actually comes from a city full of people who write about such things as well. What he does is to give a literary form to the needs, the fears, the aspirations, which in Florence generated works in Italian written only to be read within one's family circle. Petrarch also works from very young to develop languages for talking about the self. And it's in this context, and this is a very limited context, that I'll talk about his canzoniere very briefly, his lyric poetry. There's a huge amount to say about his lyric poetry. I've heard that some of you have read poem 90, in which case you get a very different view. But the poem I'd like to look at briefly is number 132. Which is a very typical poem, of not just for Petrarch, but it's what people take away from Petrarch for the next 2 centuries and more. "If it's not love, then what is it I feel? But if it's love, by God, what is this thing? If it's good, why then the bitter mortal sting? If bad, then why is every torment sweet? If I burn willingly, why weep and grieve? And if against my will, why good lamenting? O living death, O pleasurable harm, how can you rule me if I not consent? And if I do consent, it's wrong to grieve. Caught in contrasting winds in a frail boat on the high seas, I am without a helm, so light of wisdom, so laden of error, that I myself do not know what I want, and shiver in midsummer, burn in winter." This poetry contrasts sharply with the earlier love poetry of the troubadours, which Petrarch knew very well, which includes as a central, though not by any means its only form, the lover's song of farewell at dawn as he leaves his mistress's room after a night of gratified desire. Petrarch's poetry is the poetry of ungratified desire. Petrarch's poetry is the poetry of a tiny satellite going around a beautiful star, looking at it from a distance, amazed at its beauty in poem 90, amazed at the blonde hair loosed by Laura, but never able to come very close to that star. It's a poetry which is extremely vague when it comes to the qualities of the star. I'll give a prize to anyone who can tell me the color of Laura's eyes, to which 3 poems are completely dedicated and which often appear elsewhere. The hair you don't get a prize for, but that's easy in Italy. On the other hand, it's a poetry which is extraordinarily dense and precise when it comes to analyzing the emotions of the lover. It is a poetry cast in rhetorical questions, endless rhetorical questions, which sharpen and sharpen and sharpen the analysis of the lover's state, and endless paradoxes which come to terms with what it's like to love at this distance, which you will never or probably never be able to cross. These endless paradoxes of shivering in hot sun, of freezing, of burning in the winter, these paradoxes of being, of suffering living death, pleasurable harm. Those of you who've had this experience, I suspect a reasonable percentage of people in the audience have, will have an idea what he's talking about and an idea why it was such an extraordinary thing for someone to devise an idiom in which to describe it. The story, the supposed story of the Canzoniere, charmed readers for hundreds of years and gave rise to wonderful illuminations. Not that we have any actual idea of what Madonna Laura looked like, but here you see two of my favorite versions. In Renaissance terms, that would be the chaste one, and that would be the dodgier one, since they're wearing clothes. Of course, as Mark Twain remarked at one point, it would be nice to know about poor Mr. Laura, about whom we never hear. The Petrarch does remark that she's married and refused ever to consummate their love because of that. What's significant here is that this language seemed to readers from the 14th to the 17th century something profoundly powerful. It was a language you could master. It was a language you could bring into other languages, into French, into English, into Dutch, into German. It was a language with which you could learn to be a poet, and it was a language in which you could talk about this sense of love, the torment that love causes. It is the language of European lyric poetry, not the only language, for centuries after Petrarch's time. And it's a language which is even politically powerful. Queen Elizabeth loved Petrarchan poetry, enjoyed it when Walter Raleigh and other courtiers wrote it to her, wrote her own. And one way you could get out of trouble with her, even get yourself out of jail, was to write a sufficiently elegant set of Petrarchan poems to the Queen, who of course was not going to cuddle you no matter what you said, telling her how her beauty was killing you. And this actually worked. So this is an extraordinary body of writing, and again, an extraordinary body of self-analysis, which places the self and its suffering and its indescribable, always paradoxical condition at the center. One of the striking things about the letter to posterity is the ease and rapidity with which Petrarch dismisses all of this. As he says, "In my younger days I struggled constantly with an overwhelming but pure love affair, my only one, and I would have struggled with it longer had not premature death, bitter but salutary for me, extinguished the cooling flames." A little Petrarchan touch there. This is itself perhaps a hint that he gives to later poets. The masculine poet, the death of whose lover becomes something to be passed off quickly in life but made into the material for poetry. This is a gesture which is going to have a long afterlife. More to the point, though, this is one of the many places where Petrarch is constructing a self. You wouldn't know from the letter to posterity that he'd had a son with someone other than Laura and a daughter with someone other than Laura. You wouldn't know, and you wouldn't know except from the cooling flames that he'd written the poems to Laura. So in some way, for all the importance of that lyric in the self-construction of this extraordinary person and in his life as a poet, he himself sees it as secondary to other ways of constructing the self. And I should say that no one has ever agreed with him from that day to the 1980s, when a friend of mine quoted the first line of a poem from the Canzoniere in a locker room in Italy and had every other man coming out of the shower and toweling off start reciting with him until they came to the end. It was Italia Mia, but still, which is particular, but still, it was just, you know, these poems offer a note that hadn't been sounded before, and they burn themselves into minds and memories in a wonderful way. The tools that Petrarch sees as central to the self-construction that he wants to make are marble and granite, and they're ancient and they're in Latin. It's from the writings of the Romans, the Latins, and the fathers of the church that he sees himself really as building his monument. And that's how he builds the letter to posterity and much else. Now, how do you use reading to build yourself? In the first place, we have to imagine a kind of reading which isn't the sort of thing we mostly do now, or at least not the sort of thing I mostly do now. We kind of lose ourselves in books like the lady in your top left. We don't worry too much about what they are as long as they're fun. If it's a good novel, we can forget ourselves for a while. Reading in the 14th and 15th centuries was very different. There you see St. Jerome reading in the proper way in Ognissanti in Florence, reading in strenuous attentiveness, reading with really good equipment of a kind that very few people have anymore, though some of us are lucky enough to do so, as you can see in the bottom. Reading as an art form which has an ethics to it, which is carefully considered, for which you prepare yourself. Renaissance scholars would carry out rituals before they read, from combing their hair before they went upstairs to meet the ancients as they thought they were doing, to, as Machiavelli tells us, taking off his dirty clothes, putting on golden robes, and then opening his books to meet the ancients. And this is Petrarch's vision of reading. His first introduction to serious reading was very different. It came in a law school where you studied the Roman corpus of law, the ancient law of Rome compiled in the 6th century, in books like this. Now you see the two columns in the middle. That's the ancient law. What you see outside it is the commentary. The commentary was the frame that made the ancient law directly relevant to the needs of a modern Christian commercial civilization. This was the frame that told you how to take principles from ancient law and make them relevant to modern states, to the modern emperor. So if you're trying to argue that your king has an absolute right to make laws, even if there are representative institutions, you'll quote, "Quod principi placuit legis vigorum habet," what pleases the prince has the force of law, and you'll plug it into arguments. Lawyers could do this very effectively. That is why, then as now, they were highly valued. Law professors had the highest salaries in medieval universities. Some things don't change over the centuries. And law students were highly valued and eagerly snapped up when they finished at great law schools like Bologna. Petrarch tells us in his letter how much he hated this approach to reading. And he says two things which are both critical. He says, "It wasn't because I disliked the power and authority of the law, which is undoubtedly very great, or because of its endless references to Rome, Roman antiquity, which I admired, but I felt it was being degraded by those who practice it." So Petrarch had an ethics of reading. He felt that reading was not to be done for advantage, for monetary profit, for simple practical purposes. Reading the ancients was something you did for more important ends than that. Secondly, he thought if you read an ancient book, you read it to learn about the ancient world it comes from. You forget this modern frame and go back to the center, the core, and work through that to try to understand and even to recreate by a creative act the ancient world itself. And that's something that Petrarch dedicates himself to throughout his life. As he also tells us in the letter to posterity, "I always disliked my own age and would have liked to live in any other time." And he steeps himself in ancient books in order to live imaginatively as much as he can in an early time. This is his copy of the Roman historian Livy. We have only 35 books of the 140 more that Livy actually wrote, and that may be a mercy. Some people at least have thought so. Nonetheless, they didn't circulate as a whole in the Middle Ages. The 3 blocks of 10 books each were separated. Petrarch was the first person in hundreds of years to bring them together in his own manuscript. On your right here, you see him actually copying himself where the scribe has left off. So this manuscript is a creative work of his own craft as a scribe, but it's also his own work as a scholar, and you see him annotating it, going down the margins, identifying the people who are mentioned, commenting, correcting the mistakes that scribes always made. Every ancient that he could find, he subjected to this kind of process. reading him, making him grist for the mills of his own writing. Here, you can't quite see this, it's not a clear enough picture, but here he's learning that you can't fight wars without money. That's one of the lessons he takes away from Livy, exactly as Machiavelli will a couple of centuries later, only Machiavelli becomes more famous for it. Petrarch's reading is a lifelong engagement with an art and a power of its own. Here, there'll be a test on this. I just wanted to give you one little taste of the way we've learned to understand what kind of writer he is. This rather ugly piece of scroll from a manuscript in Paris is Petrarch's list of his favorite books. And as he says in the title, which took 3 great scholars in a row to transcribe correctly, these are my favorite books. I normally pass over to the rest, not as a deserter, but as a scout. Now, this is already something remarkable. He's saying, I don't care what you read in a university. I don't care what the authorities say the canon is. This is my canon. And it's a very peculiar canon because it's all pagans except for St. Augustine. It's Cicero, the great orator, it's the Roman historians, it's the Roman poets. So he's dedicating himself as a reader to a world which is pagan, though he himself is a Christian, a world which is deeply foreign, which he has to reconstruct. Even the phraseology with which he writes, he makes that title, with which he identifies this as his favorite books, is highly meaningful. Seneca, great ancient philosopher, tutor of Nero, much beloved and admired in the Middle Ages when he's seen as almost a Christian, said that if you read too many books, you get indigestion. You should read a few really good books really carefully rather than just reading a lot of books because they'll upset your mind the way, if you're at a Roman banquet, you should concentrate on dormouse and not eat the other things or they'll upset your stomach. But he says, I generally pass over into the camps of the others, not as a deserter, but as a spy. So I read a little bit, and then I come back. In the Middle Ages, this is often quoted as a warning to stick with Christian books and look only briefly at the pagan ones. As one abbot writes, if you want to have the books of Cicero, I know you're a Christian, not a Ciceronian, that you read Cicero the pagan, not as a deserter, but as a spy. So here, a warning, which in the Middle Ages meant Christians should stick with Christians, becomes for Petrarch a declaration of independence. I read what I like. I read the pagans. And this is a pose that young poets will take and that will annoy their elders for centuries to come. When Robert Graves, a very good poet, too little read now, and a considerable classical scholar, was at Oxford after serving in World War I, he was called in by his tutor who said, Mr. Graves, it has come to my attention that you prefer some books to other books. This will not do. And Petrarch is at the beginning of this line. The poet makes himself by reading what he chooses to read. Petrarch's material books become the object of a lifelong engagement that takes material form. He dates the points at which he writes particular manuscripts, like this one. And he inscribes in them big moments in his biography. So this is the wonderful painting of Virgil by Simone Martini, which is the frontispiece of his manuscript of Virgil. And in that manuscript, he entered the following note. Laura, illustrious in herself and long celebrated in my verse, first dawned upon my eyes while I was a youth at the church of St. Clara in Avignon in the year 1327 on the 6th of April at daybreak. And in that same city, in the same month of April, at that same morning hour, was that fair light withdrawn from the light of day while I was at Verona, unconscious of my loss. So the books become the record of his life. He confides to them, knowing that others will read them. And that's actually not the original note, but one of many copies of this note that circulated, knowing that this self-construction will be read and noted by others. And in fact, throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, many learned men follow Petrarch's example, making their books their confidants and knowing that people will want to have those books and read them and see their lives recorded in their margins. Now, Petrarch's way of collecting is not passive. He's not just reading. He always imitates and emulates. When he discovers Cicero's letters to Atticus in 1345, the great collection of letters from Cicero to his friend, which are an amazing source for the intellectual and political life of the Roman Republic, he takes them as his inspiration and makes not one but 4 bodies of his own letters, edited to give a sense of his life in the same way that Cicero's letters were edited. So he has a great passion for the ancient writers. But it's not a passion that blinds him to their differences from him. It's a passion that inspires a kind of powerful scrutiny. Now, Petrarch's greatest predecessor, the one who is the elephant in the room of the letter to posterity, not mentioned, though obviously tremendously important, was the great exiled Florentine poet Dante, whose Divine Comedy is even more ingrained in the culture of the world than Petrarch's Canzoniere. Dante, of course, loved the ancients. It's Virgil who takes him around in the Inferno and Purgatory in the Divine Comedy. And Virgil was very aware that ancient Romans and Greeks were not Christians. He separates them from the Christians. Virgil cannot accompany him in his final rise to the paradise, and he meets the virtuous pagans right at the top of Purgatory in a special place, which seems kind of nice, where they're sort of sitting and talking. They don't seem to be suffering a lot, even though it's purgatory. So Dante's very clear that pagans are not Christians, but he's not particularly interested in what a pagan was like. And here, from an illustrated Dante of Petrarch's lifetime, you see Dante and Virgil in hell. It's very hard to see which of them is more ancient than the other. They're portrayed wearing the same clothes, looking very much the same. Dante's vision of the ancients is as of men very much like him. Petrarch sees that the ancients are very different. When he discovers Cicero's letters to Atticus, for example, he finds out something that had been forgotten in the Middle Ages. Middle Ages, Cicero was read as a philosopher, and it was generally thought that, like a good philosopher, perhaps a monk, he had spent his life in retirement writing elaborate philosophical texts. In the letters to Atticus, you discover that he was a double-dealing politician who would praise people to one side and blame them to the other, and who was involved in all of the horrors of the late Roman Republic. And when Petrarch discovered this, he imitated Cicero's writing, but he also wrote a denunciatory letter to Cicero himself. What good do you think could come of all this engagement? And he say, how could you imagine that praising one person and damning another could be moral? And he signs the letter in the year of the god whom you never knew, 1345. Now, the view here is negative, but what matters is the rich historical sense that he begins to develop, the sense that Cicero and even Virgil, whom he loves in a way he doesn't quite love Cicero, are men different from him. So it's from these pieces which he loves, which he's gathered with great care and passion, but which are historically distant and alien, that he puts himself together. And I'll just try to show you very briefly how this works in the letter to posterity, how he makes the mosaic. Now, why do you want to have a portrait of yourself in your collection of letters? One answer is that, as we saw at the beginning, books in the Renaissance, like ancient books, often had a portrait of the author right at the beginning. And it didn't take a big stretch of the imagination to go from making that portrait a visual one to making it a verbal one. More important, though, is the fact that great ancient writers had biographies, which often appeared at the beginnings of their works. So, for example, there was a biography of Virgil ascribed to another great Roman writer, Suetonius, a wonderful biographer and scholar. Petrarch would have thought he wrote it, which you would have found at the beginning of a commentary on Virgil, widely read by Petrarch, among others. And this is a really quite interesting biography. It makes clear that Virgil actually invented that whole thing about giving up law to be a poet. He pleaded one single case in court, but no more, for he spoke very slowly and almost like an uneducated man. So it turns out that when Petrarch is giving up the law to be a poet, he's actually reenacting an ancient script. And this is something that he and his readers know. The life traces the ways in which Virgil makes a poetic career, starting with his bucolics, the 10 short pastoral poems, moving to the Georgics, his 4 poems about farming, each of them dedicated to a different patron who had saved him from ruin, and coming to a climax. Last of all, he began the Aeneid, a varied and complicated theme which mirrored the poems of Homer, treated Greek and Latin personages, and contained at the time an account of the origin of the city of Rome and of Augustus, which was his special aim. What you see here is a vision of the poet's life as a career, taking on more and more ambitious projects until the climax is reached with the one project which is impossible to imagine bettering. And this is the vision that Petrarch accepts in the letter to posterity, where he talks about himself in exactly the same way, going from bucolic to epic poetry, making a career. Most remarkable is the way in which Suetonius imagines the Aeneid as having a miraculous success. Hardly was it begun when it became so famous that Petrarch didn't hesitate to declare, "Yield ye Roman writers, yield ye Greeks, a greater than the Iliad has been born." And it's clear that Petrarch is inspired by this, I think, to say that his Africa had the same kind of success before anyone had actually read it. Now, you'll often read that nobody read the Africa. This is not actually true. It was very widely read. We have many copies with notes by later readers that showed they were as gripped by his book as Petrarch was by ancient books. Nonetheless, you can see the way he's shaping his career. It is in part a Virgilian career. And yet, Petrarch is always original, so it's not a wholly Virgilian career. Suetonius' Life of Virgil makes clear that landed property is important for poets. And it's the patrons who give Virgil landed property who save him from the misery and ruin of the civil wars. Well, landed property also takes a prominent place in Petrarch's life, but it's a different one. For him, it's property in the country is what the poet needs, for it's only in the country that you find inspiration. As he says, you can't do poetry in a big, nasty city full of noise and corruption. And he denounces Avignon, the papal capital, as Babylon. These are his sonnets about Babylon as read by a censor in the 16th century, who, as you see, thought they were too hot to be printed. And what he found in place of Babylon was the beautiful valley of Vaucluse with the river Sorgue, where he said he could do his early work. Later, near Padua, Arquois, where he could write his later works. For Petrarch, the literary career is something you can only pursue away from society, away from politics, away from corruption. This is a model of the poet's life, which again will have an enormous posterity to it. Here's a wonderful 18th century view from Petrarch's house at Arquois, which gives you a little bit of a sense of it. Now, Suetonius was a good model, but he didn't have everything Petrarch needed. For one thing, he was writing in the third person, and Petrarch wanted to write about himself. But here, too, he found ancient help in the poetry of the great Roman poet Ovid, exiled under Augustus and the author of the Tristia, the sad poems from exile in the Black Sea. In one of these, Ovid actually begins saying, "Listen, posterity, and find out who this I was, this playful poet of tender passions you read." He tells you where he was born and when he was born, and that he was a person of good birth. Petrarch clearly takes off from this when he begins the letter to posterity by saying, "You may perhaps have heard of me." He nicely makes his tone a little more modest than Ovid's. He knows about a lot of ancient writers whose books he doesn't have, so he pretends to be writing to readers very distant about books that they may not even have read. Yet clearly, he's learned from Ovid to be able to imagine a far future. And this, too, is something extraordinary in the poetic career of a modern, this sense that a modern, like an ancient, can be writing to be read thousands of years in his own future by people unknown to him of radically different life and culture. Yet, Ovid does some things that Petrarch doesn't do, and those are significant, too. In particular, well, he does quit law school, and in that way, he, too, gives support to Petrarch for that decision. But Ovid praises the poets of his generation. Ovid makes clear, and what's really the most elegant and richest part of this poem, that he sees himself as part of a poetic avant-garde, a group of poets who wrote to and read to one another, poets who reinforced each other. And these are, of course, the poets who really invent a kind of personal love poetry, very urban poetry, very different from Petrarch's love poetry, the poetry of the guy who's standing outside the door of his mistress's house while the dogs bark at him, worried that the husband may see him. Very different, much more disorderly, and often, to me, much more attractive. Petrarch, by contrast, leaves this out. You read the letter to posterity and you have no sense that Petrarch is a figure in a literary landscape, that he has a friend, Giovanni Boccaccio, who'd written a life of him, which he actually took ideas from when he wrote the letter to posterity, that Dante was there in the background. Petrarch's vision of himself as a writer is the vision of how I won the war, the lonely poet whose creation out in the country is all his own. And that's a vision of poetic accomplishment, which, like the vision of the poet as detached from society, will have a huge posterity. It's no accident that Petrarch is so beloved in the Romantic period, when this vision of what a poet is developed so powerfully. Yet in the end, Petrarch would say it's not just that he wasn't only a poet and a writer. The most important thing about him was not that he was a poet and a writer. He would always have said the most important thing about him was that he was a Christian, trying to lead a Christian life. And you find that too in the letter to posterity. You find him talking about his extraordinary efforts to find support from patrons in the church, to lead a life which will be free of illegitimate passion, to lead a life which will be virtuous. And in this enterprise, the book that mattered most to Petrarch, it's the one Christian author who he put in his list of favorite books, is, of course, the Confessions of St. Augustine, the classic Christian account of what it is to try to come to terms with yourself as a Christian, to lead a Christian life, having, in Augustine's case, been a pagan, having engaged in the pleasures of the flesh, having seen everything that secular life had to offer. And Petrarch loved Augustine in the most passionate and intimate way. A friend, his confessor, gave him a tiny copy of the Confessions, which he carried with him everywhere. And Petrarch continually measures himself against Augustine. What you need to know about Augustine, what you'll always hear about Augustine, is the funny things. When Augustine praying, "Lord, give me chastity," but not yet. But those things in Augustine are always the relics of a past which he has abandoned. Augustine writes when he has reached peace, when he has reached a final and full conversion. He writes as a great Christian, looking back on a past which disturbs him, but which now has taken on a sense. And Petrarch loves this book and takes it with him everywhere. For example, when he climbed the real mountain, the one real mountain he climbed, Mount Ventoux, near Avignon, in 1336, he tells us that he took his copy of St. Augustine with him. And in the letter that he writes about this climb, which he actually rewrote several times over the next 20 years, so I wouldn't take it too literally, he describes climbing the mountain with his brother. His brother chugs right up to the top, whereas he keeps going down side paths and not getting anywhere. And to the reader who knows that the brother had become a Carthusian monk, the strictest monks in all of Christendom, whereas Petrarch had had boys and girls and so on, you can see what this meant. This was a kind of allegory of the life of virtue. But finally, they get to the top, they look around them, they see the world at the feet of the mountain, and Petrarch pulls his little copy of Augustine out of his breast, and what does it say? What does it say? It says, "Men go about to look at the mountains and they forget themselves." And he realizes that he shouldn't have climbed the mountain at all, that he should have been engaged on self-improvement, not the allegorical self-improvement of the climb, but the real effort to make himself moral. So he tells the story, and then he tells us how he goes down to the inn, and he writes the letter very quickly, because if he didn't write it quickly, his mood might change. This is Augustine without the final conversion. written for people who've read their Augustine and know that this is Augustine without the final conversion. This is a man who's measuring himself against Augustine and saying, you know, when I measure myself against that standard, it doesn't fit me. I don't reach this final resolution, this final peace, this final sense of absolute peace in being a Christian, this lack of aspiration for fame as a writer or as a teacher, just doesn't work for me. And that, I think, is also the story of the letter to posterity, which ends in such a curious way, a way which I think is very deliberate. It ends with Petrarch living in Italy, losing another patron and saying, I just couldn't stay there anymore. I just couldn't stay. And so I went back to France, even though there was no particular reason for me to go to France, the way a sick man will try to move from one place to another, just so the change might do him some good. So Petrarch's letter to posterity, in the end, like his letter on the ascent of Mount Ventoux, commemorates not his ability to do what Augustine had done, but his inability to do what Augustine had done, his inability to live by what anyone would have agreed in his time was a supreme pattern of the Christian life. So the Petrarch who is a Christian, who is living in the world of the church, is as social as the Petrarch who is a poet is asocial. He tells you about all of his wonderful patrons and friends, the clerics who supported him. He tells you that he was luckier than St. Augustine, for St. Ambrose treated Augustine like a father, and that's a reference to a famous scene in the Confessions, which Augustine is sitting in Ambrose's study, and Ambrose is reading silently, and Augustine doesn't dare interrupt him and say, could you give me some advice, please? And Petrarch says, I was luckier. I had spiritual counselors who treated me as a brother, who gave me everything I needed. And yet, in the end, Petrarch is never able to pretend to build himself in public as another Augustine, any more than he was quite another Cicero or another Virgil or another Ovid. And that second self-creation, the self-creation of somebody who is a Christian, but not a really good Christian, and knows it, that is also part of his extraordinary modernity. That is the writing of someone who thinks, as those Florentines thought for their children, so he thinks for a wider public. What's worth remembering are his struggles, his failures, his inability to live the life that he should. Petrarch gets something of his ability to write this way from Augustine. There's nobody who's better than Augustine at noting the detail that really gives life. When Augustine wants to tell you what man is like without salvation, he says, have you ever seen a baby that wants the breast? This baby going, Wah! With this incredible fury, absolutely no morality, absolutely no restraint. That's what we're like before salvation. And Petrarch learns from him that kind of observation. But Petrarch never learns, and he wants us to know he never learned, Augustine's ability to know that he had passed over into another state where such things were something to be observed and remembered. And this, too, is a new note, never struck before, the note of a man who is uncertain, but who is certain that his very uncertainty, the very wanderings of his personality and his soul, are worth recording and will be of interest. That, too, is an idea which will have a long posterity in Montaigne and many others. So, it's an extraordinary act of self-creation, an arc that's deliberately left a little bit incomplete, a mosaic in which all the pieces never quite fit. And yet, it is an act which is extraordinarily successful. No writer of Petrarch's time, a time, I'll remind you, when books have to be copied to be circulated, was more widely read, or put a deeper stamp on writers for generations to come, or became more of what he clearly wanted to be, someone famous for things that nobody had ever been famous before. Famous for his poetic career, famous for his erudition, but famous also for his failures and uncertainties. And I think it's there more than anywhere else that we can look at Petrarch directly and see him as somehow closer to us than those ancients, and there that his perception is most clear. Thank you.
was, yeah.
Good.
We'll give a couple of seconds just for people who need to leave to get up. But we now have about half an hour for questions. We're going to circulate these two mics. So please just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll get a microphone to you, and you can ask it. It's at the bottom. Yeah?
Oh, question.
I don't see. Where?
There.
Oh, there. Okay.
So obviously, like, people don't read as extensively as they did before or write letters to themselves as was the Florentine tradition. So what is there an equivalent today, or is sort of like technology taking that away, or what is the equivalent today?
If Petrarch were alive today, he would have a Twitter feed like you wouldn't believe. And it seems to me that this is exactly that there are a lot of equivalents. One of the things that we want to know about writers is everything. If you're interested in a contemporary writer, you might well read a biography, which will be 800 pages about what she had for breakfast every day. That vision of the author as someone, every bit of whose life matters, that's something that I think really is a kind of modern creation that starts with Petrarch. But besides that, I have a friend who's a wonderful historian, but she's also become a brilliant writer of vampire novels for tweens. And she's written 2 really excellent history books and 2 really remarkable vampire novels, one of which was at #1 in the bestseller list. And in her life as a vampire novelist, she lives like Petrarch. She tells us everything about herself. Her fans want to know which of her horses she's riding and which wines she's drinking and what color she wears for which ceremony. And all of that sense of the writer as a celebrity, that sense that the granular details of a writer's life really matter. I think that idea of literary celebrity and that all goes back to him. I think he'd have done really well in the current environment.
I think when you're writing, you always want to present some sort of a reconciliation and a resolution to your struggles and problems. And I thought you made a very interesting point when you said that Petrarch, eventually his writings showed more of his struggles and his irresolvable struggles and problems than that kind of clear solution. So do you think he struggled with that while he was writing? Do you think he one side of him really wanted to present some sort of solution to his problems, but the other side of him thought, well, honestly, I haven't come to a solution, and I can't write something like that?
Thank you. It's a wonderful question. So partly, of course, he is the heir of ancient writing, and one of the kinds of writing that really matters to him are ancient philosophical dialogues. And the whole point, or one of the big points of, say, one of Cicero's dialogues is generally to present different cases without necessarily resolving them, because it's the reader who is supposed to do the resolution. So I just happened recently to be working on Cicero's dialogue on divination, where he shows you in one book that you have to be an idiot to believe that you can read the future from the livers of animals. And then in the next book, his brother gives a very reasoned defense of why you might want to do this. And I was taught that, of course, the critical part is right and the other part is wrong, but I think we don't read it that way anymore. I think we now read it as very much one side and then the other. So as a thinker, Petrarch is rebelling to some extent against the absolute philosophical systems of the medieval university in favor of this ancient idea of presenting different views and letting the reader work them out. Where I don't see he clearly learns a huge amount from Roman poets when it comes to talking about his struggles and the way in which you can tear yourself apart over love. But I think that the way in which he defines himself as a would-be moral being who is never certain that he has become that being, that's a deliberate decision which goes against what readers would expect. I hate to confess this, but in Europe, when they teach the Ascent of Mount Ventoux, they say, see, he's the first American because he'll tell you too much. And he said, I got to tell you what's happened before my mood changes. In the Northeast, I'm sorry to say, people have been known to say he's the first Californian. I apologize, but confessional, deeply worried about his own moods. But what I do think is really vital there is this note he stresses of portraying the self in all of its wandering and all of its irresolution. And this is something that many of his readers, not by any means all of his readers, many of his readers just say, ooh, he's really learned, this is cool. Read Petrarch, I don't have to read all those ancients because I can learn all the stuff that he's put together. But the most intelligent of his readers see this and develop it. And I think that great kinds of writing like the essay of the 16th century owe something to the experiments that he's carrying out in the 14th.
During your, is this on?
Yeah, I think it's on.
During your presentation, you showed a slide with some pretty impressive reading materials. Like there was this kind of a wheel that you had multiple books on. I'm just curious, like, do you read all those books at the same time and just turn the crank, or like, what is that?
So before you had the computer, which is what I do, unfortunately, much of my reading now when I'm not reading on my iPad. But before, in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, you had these wonderful machines for reading because you often would be in the position of needing to compare 2 or 3 books. If you're reading Macrobius writing about Virgil, you also want to have your Virgil, so you probably want to have Servius's commentary. So you need several books at the same time, and a Ferris wheel for books or a lateral reading would enable you to do that, to sort of whip your books around. So back in the early 90s, one of these was built for an exhibit I did about the world of books and readers in the Renaissance. And when the exhibit was over, the library that housed it had no room for the wheel. And so I woke up one day with a knock at the door, and there was the head librarian with this wheel. So what I actually did was put my dictionaries on it. So it has my Latin and Greek and Hebrew dictionaries and my dictionary of the Oxford Classical Dictionary. And until about 4 years ago, I could actually get better information faster whipping it around. But now all of the good dictionaries are available online and even better. So I haven't yet come up with a new use for it. I'm afraid it's feeling sad. It just sits there neglected. Now that you can get the Greek dictionary on your phone. My favorite app.
So did the demands of Petrarch's appointment as a papal secretary conflict with his ideals of writing about himself personally?
Oh, sorry, I made myself unclear. He turned down all of these great offers.
Oh, okay.
See, it's even cooler to have all of the offers and say no.
Oh, okay. Oh, nice.
So no, and this is actually a huge question for his admirers later in the Renaissance, because there were other scholars who believed that Cicero had actually been right to throw himself into the political struggles in the Republic, had been right to try to save the Republic rather than to let it become something like an empire. And for them, they actually admired Dante, who had been politically engaged and was thrown out of Florence as a political exile, more than Petrarch, who inherited his exile and really was only politically engaged a little bit at the end of his life as a sort of ornamental counselor in various North Italian courts. So, but this is Petrarch is the intellectual who never accepts a position which will involve him in too much practical activity, because that will mean Babylon. That means the city, which he writes about wonderfully, with the carriages throwing up mud and the squeaking wheels and the corrupt people and everything that he hates in the big city.
I wonder if I could just jump in and ask you to follow up on that interesting passage where he talks about hating his own time. It seems like there's something intrinsically related between any project of self-fashioning and a kind of sense that time is out of joint, or almost perhaps kind of self-hatred. And Lanier is talking about this in his class, that for the project of self-fashioning to occur, you need to have this almost disjunction between a self you'd like to become and the self you are. And so is Petrarch one of the first to sort of be aware of that split self?
I think so, but I think it's a question of fashioning a self that isn't already given. because there are lots of selves out there that you can fashion pretty easily. I mean, you can fashion a professorial self, by becoming a pedant and learning an enormous amount and growing a beard, and it's relatively, we're actually issued these sport coats. You didn't know that, did you? So it's actually, that's a self which is given, and many and most people, I think, in most societies, build selves on models and relatively simple models that are already out there. What's so remarkable about Petrarch, and I think it is something that people do when they're out of joint, is that he builds a self that doesn't look like anybody else's self. Michel de Montaigne, whom I'm sure you'll be encountering in some of these courses, again, is someone who retires from a life of political engagement to build a self. Now, what he doesn't tell you is he's actually negotiating the end of the French Wars of Religion while he's doing that, but the self that he creates is very much a self who has the time, the leisure, the detachment to worry about his moral being while his country is being torn apart by the worst civil wars that Europe had ever seen. So yeah, I think these things do go with this does go with a kind of furious dislike. It can also, however, go with tremendous disappointment. I think one of the other great self-building moments in the West is the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And I think a lot of that goes with terrible disappointment over the French Revolution and its failure to create a lasting republic and to transform the world as many people had thought that it would. And I think many of the great writers of the early 19th century fashioned themselves in, not so much in hatred of the world around them as in disappointment at that their youth hasn't panned out as they hoped that it would.
I think many of us who are here today are here because we are very much interested in living the examined life and tackling such intellectual challenges, just as Petrarch was. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing with us some your journey as how you've come to fashion not your factory-made professorial self, but to become Professor Anthony Grafton.
Ooh, yeah, that one's tough. So. Well, I'm also the product of a generation which had high hopes, most of which were not borne out. And many of the wonderful things that have happened in my life, in my society, were not the ones that seemed to be happening when I was young in the 60s. So the tremendous opening of opportunity to women, to people of color, to people of many kinds of sexual identity were not actually the things which the 60s generation was most concentrated on. And the world has changed much more in those ways than in the political ways we thought it was going to in the 60s. So what is it like, having been a fairly engaged person then, to be a professor? One point is very clear, I think, and that is that we professors are not particularly valuable people in the world in the way that some other people are. When I look at my daughter, who is a New York City school teacher, I think, okay, I'm not going to try to compete with what she's doing for this extraordinary multi-racial, cultural, recent immigrant group of kids of every imaginable kind, whom she takes at lunchtime and teaches Latin because the school doesn't teach Latin. No, professors, most professors really can't make that kind of moral claim, I think. What we do, what I see myself as trying to do, and I've come to this over a long time, is first of all, I see myself as a seducer. I'm trying to seduce a few people every year to do the Petrarch, the Ovid thing, and to abandon themselves to a life of pursuing, not in any way the stuff that I do, but just the intellectual enterprise that matters most to them. Because I think it is tremendously important for any society, and especially for a complicated, commercial, gain-seeking society like ours, to have people who do this in the university, outside the university. I have former students who do this as freelance writers. I have former students who do this as academics, but I have former students for whom this has taken them into a life in public schools. But it seems to me that this seduction, these institutions exist, and there's a reason why Stanford is so rich. It's the same reason Princeton is so rich. You know, we're here to produce a next generation of people who will hold the levers that run society. But every time I can seduce a few people into doing something else, I feel that's one kind of success. So I teach in a course for freshmen, which is a very demanding double course, half your load for the whole year, which goes from Plato, which goes from Homer and Genesis to Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. We read no secondary sources, got a mix of faculty, including crazy graybeards and brilliant young postdocs, and we do very intense work and lots of hours. And so one year, there was a woman who registered for this class, and after the second day, she came to me and she said, "Oh, I get it, I won't be back." And I sort of scratched my head. And she went and she registered for first year Latin and first year Greek, and she's now a classicist. So I feel, you know, if the entire class did that, we could go to the dean and say, you know, okay, nunc dimittis, we've done our job. But you don't want the whole class to do that. But you do want to have those successes, not to reproduce ourselves. I couldn't care less if I never produced another historian of the Renaissance. Well, I'd be sad, but that's not what I'm out to do. I'm out to try to help those few people who probably do want to devote their lives to something outside the obvious channels. And I'm sure you have those here. At Princeton, they talk about the great sucking sound. I guess here it's probably the great sucking sound of Silicon Valley, and in Princeton it's the great sucking sound of Wall Street. Sort of, you know, you're a senior and suddenly, and you're there. And so, so that's one of the things I'm trying to do. Another thing I'm trying to do, and this is a harder thing because I think anybody appreciates that, people who've, you know, our own alumni who are lawyers and doctors say, yes, that's exactly what you should be doing. You know, please. Once we have a party every year for our graduating seniors, and one of my seniors had decided to be a high school teacher. And her father comes over to meet me, as they do, and he says, "So, hi, you're her teacher, right?" And I say, "Yeah." He says, "So, hi, I went to Princeton, and I'm a doctor. That's her grandfather. He went to Princeton, and he's a famous surgeon. And her great-grandfather, now deceased, went to Princeton, and he was a doctor." I was going like this, and then he said, "And I think it's about time we had a change. What a great choice." So I think that's another thing I try to do is to train a very small number of people to do the kind of history that I do. Because I do think that matters. It's a kind of history which was really barely studied. Very few people in America were doing this work on scholars in the past when I was young. It really wasn't popular. And I've had the great good fortune both to have wonderful students who've carried it on, to have other people appear who were also interested, and now we're a feature of the historical landscape in a big way. And this for me is a huge satisfaction because we really have changed the way that educated people, we've changed the way textbooks are written, we've changed the way the past is presented in an important way. And as we're kind of the professional memory of society, I do think that's important. The third thing that I've tried to do, and this came relatively late, my generation were not institutional people. We always thought institutions, we kind of thought they were Babylon. And even when I became a professor, it took me a long time to think that the professional association where, you know, which represents all 14,000 historians in America, which comes together once a year in a show of bad fashion, the like of which the universe hath not seen. It took me a long, and which we still read papers to each other. I mean, it's insane. If you go to sessions all day, 3 people will read papers to you in a monotone every hour on the hour. It's like a form of torture. And I could never see the point of this, but now I do, because this society is all we've got to put the little bit of pressure we can put on universities to, if they're going to hire adjuncts, to treat them decently, if they're going to think about their university presses, to see why a university press matters, to try to make standards for what it is to teach history at the, what are we doing with an undergraduate history major? We're not training historians, we're trying to train people to think and give them skills and values that will be useful. It's only at that level that we think about that. Nobody's got time anymore at the local level. So I became an institutional person, completely to my surprise, and I've spent 6 years on the council of this organization. I've written about it, I've worked with it. One of the things we're now doing with the Modern Language Association, which is they're the most famous of these bodies because every year at Christmas, the newspapers write these silly MLA-tricks articles about the Modern Language Association. We're too boring to get that, but we're trying to work out what a PhD education should be like in the humanities, given that about 1/3 of our PhDs don't actually end up taking academic jobs. One of the things we've never done is ask if that's a new thing. It turns out that in history, 1/3 of our PhDs never took academic jobs, going back to the 1890s. And so there's a real question why we're training all of them in exactly the same way when 33% of them are going to do a vast range of other things. Are there ways in which we could tweak what we do for graduate students to be more realistic about what they're going to do when they get out? These are things that we only think about at that level of the convention, the vast Walpurgisnacht of tedious scholars together. And so in my dotage, I've become a passionate believer in that and have really tried to work for it.
So I think we choose diction in our writing for reasons obviously beyond the definition of the words we say. And it's almost as if the words we choose have a meaning themselves syntactically. Do we lose some of the real meaning of Petrarch in the translation of his work? And to what extent is that true?
Oh, that's terribly, terribly so. Learn languages, please. This is hugely, hugely true. Then the better the translation in some ways, the more it makes you wish that students could read the original as well. As a historian, I do most of my source teaching in English, and it really hurts because there's so much that you miss when you can't see the original and see the references that are in the original. Learned writers, and for most of Western history, most writers were learned, wrote allusively. They wrote with, actually pop music is a better model for the way most writing was in the Western tradition than modern literature, because contemporary literature is often written without much relation to past literature. But in the same way that so much music is densely related to earlier music, and only those strange people who used to hang out at shops that sold records when there were shops that sold records recognized them all. That's the way in which, say, the art of Latin literature was created. It's this dense web of relation with Greek literature and then later Latin with earlier Latin. You can't get that if you don't read it in the original. So that's just, it's, I mean, I can't say enough how much that is the core of humanism. If it has a core, is, find a way to read the thing in the original if you possibly can, even if you're stumbling along. Perseus, to say, if you don't know about Perseus, Perseus gives you Latin and Greek texts mined so you can look up every word and find out what they are. It's the best trot that's ever been invented. But if you have a text and you want to get a sense, it's a way to get a little bit of a sense, and anything is better than just the translation.
So this question is probably going to be a lot less serious, but you were speaking, Professor, about how Petrarch was very concerned with morality and how he might have transgressed it and going up the mountain all the wrong ways. And I was looking at your slide with the picture of him and Laura and the two different pictures, and I was just wondering, because you were saying, oh, the one where they're clothed is actually much less chaste, how his understanding of morality would have differed from ours, because that was a big culture shock.
Well, just as it's famous that at a rival institution in New Haven, which none of you would have considered attending, there is a custom of the nude party. And it is well known that at the nude party, no one ever looks down, much less does anything else happen. So in the Renaissance, the sign of chastity was nudity. The chaste Venus was always the naked Venus, not concealing anything, pure and visible. Whereas clothing is seductive. You don't know what's under clothing. So so just think of it as the Yale vision of chastity.
Okay, maybe we have time for one last question.
Okay, since Petrarch was largely influenced by a society where people were very competitive and worried about the future and whatnot, and he has a lot of references to self-reflection and his failures and whatnot, to what extent is Petrarch meant to be read as a way to help future learn how to lead a life?
That, I think, is right at the core of what I was trying to say. That is, in the Western tradition before him, if you wrote your life, you would write it as a lesson. Now, you could write about a wicked life. Abelard writes about a wicked life in the 12th century, a very wicked life. He abused the faith of his student, seduced her. He did terrible things, and he also, as he himself says, was ambitious and careerist. But he writes this from the standpoint of one who's been broken physically and morally and come through and become a different person. And what makes Petrarch, to me, so different from that is that he hasn't. I recognize somebody like me who is struggling and grimy and would really like to be better than he is. Every time I think, I could have gotten that chapter back sooner to that student, or I could have done this or done that. I think, I'm a really very imperfect person. And Petrarch cheers me up a little bit. He doesn't excuse, he doesn't forgive, but that sense that of human imperfection as a lesson we can learn, with even a lesson that can be made into literature itself. For me, there's something really profound about that.
All right, well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I think that we can all agree that very many people were probably seduced today. So thank you so much, Tony. And for those of you who didn't get a chance to ask questions, we'll have a whole other session next Friday with two other guest speakers, David Lovis from the Italian department right here, and Paul Finland, to keep talking about Grafton going to lecture. So write your questions down, bring them back next week.
Thank you. That was just spot on for the whole program for this